If you're anything like me, you might have finished reading Onyx Storm, spoiler warning if you haven't, and thought to yourself, what in the F just happened at the end of the Xaden POV chapter and the entire final chapter? You probably recognize that it's meant to be opaque, and if you were a casual reader, you might be fine with the idea of just waiting for the next book in the Empyrean series to find out things like what happened during the 12 hours of Violet's missing memories. But if you're watching this video, I'm guessing you're not just a casual reader, and you're here in hopes that someone may have sussed out at least some of the details of what the heck that cryptic conversation between Xaden and Sgaeyl meant, and other things like that. Well, there's still plenty of stuff that we can't know with complete certainty, like who Xaden's new brother is, but we can at least narrow that kind of thing down quite a bit, and after going back to dissect the last 3 chapters in particular, I think it is possible to explain a lot more than seemed apparent on the first read, so let's get into it. Okay, at the end of chapter 65, the one from Xaden's POV, he asks Sgaeyl if she'll forsake him now, presumably inquiring whether she's about to sever the bond. She retorts, "What is there left of you to forsake?" And then we get this exchange. "You tell me." I lower the ice to let her in. Lowering the ice clearly means lowering his mental shields to allow her access to his mind and the plan that he's formulated, because... Her next breath is laced with sulfur and her eyes widen. "You cannot mean to..." "You saw what happened. It is the only way." The way he interrupts her effectively prevents us from learning what his plan is, but based on context, I think we can figure out some of the broad strokes here. I'm going to take the rest of that conversation line by line and shed as much light as I can on what the heck they're talking about. She glances over her shoulder. "And you think she'll help?" "She loves me." So the she here is pretty clearly Violet. "Tern does not, and you haven't looked in a mirror yet. The red veins branching from her eyes look like her lightning." "She'll help." It comes out with a hell of a lot more certainty than I feel. "She promised." "Even if she agrees, no one will..." "Someone owes me a favor." So what the heck is that about? Well, I'm sure there's a lot more to Xaden's plan, but clearly one small part of it, based on the last chapter, is to marry Violet, presumably to make her the Duchess of Tyrrendor so that she can rule the province, since it seems like he's going MIA. So I'm all but certain that when Sgaeyl says, "even if she agrees, no one will," that means even if Violet agrees to marry him, no one will perform the ceremony. It seems like in their society, for a union to be legally binding, they have to be married by a priest or priestess of one of the gods' temples, and none of them would be willing to do that now that the veins next to his eyes clearly mark him as a Venin. But then Xaden responds, "Someone owes me a favor," and in the last chapter, the missive in Violet's pocket is an official blessing of their legal binding marriage from the High Priestess of Dune's temple. And if you remember from chapter 55, after they saved Dune's temple in Eratia during the earlier attack, the High Priestess writes to Xaden saying she is in his debt and owes him whatever favor he sees fit. So it seems pretty clear that he called in that favor to have the High Priestess marry them. This also explains why it was so important that they protect Dune's temple during the earlier attack. Presumably, Auric foresaw all this and told Violet to protect the temple so that they'd earn that favor they'd need later. That gives me some hope that Auric has already seen, or at least will be able to see, the path that they'll need to follow through the last 2 books to ultimately win the war. Alright, so the next line in that conversation has Sgaeyl telling Xaden, "He'll never let you near her." Her tail flicks. "Especially while she lies in a vulnerable state." As you'll see in a second, this is clearly referring to Tern and Violet. "Is she hurt?" The beating organ behind my ribs stumbles and I reach down the bond that connects my mind to hers, but it's muddled with unconsciousness. "Yes," Sgaeyl says slowly, her head moving in a serpentine motion. "But she will survive." She pauses. "They have completed the wards, but they extend no further than Draithus." This seems to be referencing what occurred at the end of the Imogen POV chapter when Garrick asks Trissa, "Are you weaving?" and she replies, "We're starting, but they'll be weak until we can bolster with more power, but they're our best shot." We also learned earlier in that chapter that they'd brought 2 cases of daggers into the city and were working on something, and at the very end of the chapter, Imogen unsheathes her last alloy-hilted dagger, slips Quinn's last dagger from her thigh sheath, and instructs Glayne to tell every rider within the walls to get over here and disarm. It's the only way we're going to live through this. Some other important context is that this final battle takes place after Leothin, the older dragon from Andarna's den, fires Oratia's wardstone. So Oratia now has stable wards just like Basgiath, and they cover most of Tyrrendor. And remember that the original Basgiath wards are boosted and extended far beyond their natural limits by the alloy daggers stored in the armories of the Navarian outposts, like the spokes of an umbrella, as we learned in Iron Flame. Putting all these pieces together, it seems like a pretty safe guess that they managed to use the same mechanism to extend Oratia's wards to cover Draithus. Finally, at the end of their conversation, Xaden is saying, "Persuade Tern. I beg, everything depends on it." "We will ask," Sgaeyl finally says, flexing her claws in the rocky soil, "and her decision will determine our fate." Those are terms I can agree to. We're airborne in less than a minute. First of all, I think Sgaeyl's use of the words "we" and "our fate" make it safe to assume that she is not going to sever their bond. In fact, it feels to me like she just committed herself to trying to execute the entirety of Xaden's master plan, which, as you'll see in a minute, is so vast and treacherous that it shows their bond is actually stronger than ever. I'm pretty sure that big parts of his plan are arguably downright evil, but even despite that, she recognizes that it'll be the only way to win the war. She still respects his ruthlessness and that he's willing to do anything that is necessary to accomplish his goal, and since she has the same goal, she decides that she's going to be in this with him until the bitter end. So, what am I talking about? What else does the plan entail besides marrying Violet so she can take over as Duchess of Tyrrendor? Well, here's where things seem a little less clear and also start to broach on subjects that are sure to be important plot points in the next book. So if you don't want to hear any speculation into potential spoilers later in the series, this is your cue to click away now. But I think we can be reasonably sure about several points of the plan which do technically fall within the events of Onyx Storm chronologically. They just happened during the 12 hours of Violet's memory that Imogen wiped. So if you'd like to dive into that kind of thing, including who Xaden's new brother is, let's get into it. Let's pick up in the final chapter, which returns to Violet's POV when the writer named Wilson is giving his report to Brennan. He says, "Official numbers are 4 riders, their dragons, and 3 elders murdered in the valley in what we're estimating is the last few hours." Those deaths occurring in the last few hours suggest that shit has continued to go down since the battle in Draithus ended roughly 12 hours ago. Is this related to Xaden's secret plan? Unfortunately, I think so, but I'll come back to that in a bit. Wilson continues, "And we still have 5 riders missing. 4 now." He adds, looking at me, "But after that display, we all know Ryerson did this. I bet the other 3 are already dead." There were 5 riders and their dragons missing, but that included Violet and Xaden, so I think there are 3 unaccounted for, and I think it's safe to assume that one of them was Panchek, and one is whoever Xaden's new brother is. And to be explicit, we're talking about a rider that turned Venin, so he's now Xaden's brother in the Dark Wielder fraternity, or whatever you want to call it, under Berwyn. Let's pause for a minute on that point. Near the beginning of the penultimate chapter, Xaden wonders, how could he do this? Choose this after watching me stumble and fall over the last 5 months? So clearly it's someone who knew Xaden was Venin, which narrows it down quite a bit. But if we assume he's been aware for the full 5 months, there are only 2 people that we're sure fit that criteria, Garrick and Bodhi. The argument could be made that as a precog, maybe Auric knew all along, and I do think he's probably been involved in a lot more scheming than we know about at this point, but I highly doubt he's the new Venin brother. I think his fate is to eventually ascend to the throne of Navarre. I'm willing to bet it's either Garrick or Bodhi, and my first impression was that it's Garrick, but frankly, there seems to be more context to suggest that it's Bodhi. I was thinking Garrick because at the end of Imogen's POV chapter, after Trissa tells him the wards will be weak until they can be bolstered with more power, he says, "It's still not enough." Garrick's head hangs as he stands. "I can't." He sighs and strides through the door. A minute later, Imogen shouts at him, asking where he's going, and we get this. "I can't walk again. Even if I made it to Aracia, I'd never be strong enough to get back," he calls over his shoulder. "So I'd better find some fucking way to do something." That sounds like he's perfectly primed to need to draw more power from somewhere. If he channeled from the source, he could have used that power to distance wield himself to Aracia and return with enough daggers to complete the ward extension, which we know was ultimately successful. Granted, it's possible that Imogen's efforts that we already talked about succeeded in putting a relatively weak ward extension in place, which could explain why it only covers Draithus. So maybe what Garrick says is a red herring, and we're meant to think it's him, and the big reveal in the next book could be that it's actually Bodhi. That could make a lot of sense, because throughout Onyx Storm, Bodhi gets a lot of character development, suggesting that he's dissatisfied with the path that others are laying out for him to follow. He knew all along it was only a matter of time before Xaden turned fully, and he hated the idea of succeeding him to become the next Duke of Tyrrendor. The fact that Xaden went to such lengths to install Violet as the Duchess of Tyrrendor might suggest that doing so was necessary, which could be the case if the title can't just be passed down to Bodhi because he's turned. There are also a couple of odd things we're aware of Bodhi doing during the final battle that suggest that he was struggling emotionally. When Taryn orders all of the dragons and their riders to the ground, Bodhi is the only one who foolishly disobeys until Imogen and Dane have to follow to rescue him. And then, in that same scene where Imogen follows Garrick outside and he's reaching his low point, we also get this tidbit. Bodhi is on his hands and knees across the town square, retching. We have no other context as to why this is happening, and I have to imagine we'll come to find out that the reason is nothing good. There's also all of the foreshadowing throughout all 3 books to Xaden and Bodhi being brothers. Most people who previously came up with theories about this, including myself, were predicting that they'd turn out to be literal brothers by blood, or at least half-brothers. But if it was Bodhi that turned, all of that might turn out to have been foreshadowing that was building up to them becoming brothers here in this sense. Alright, let's get back to the last chapter. Wilson's report continues, and so far the tally is at 6 missing eggs from the hatching grounds, but they're double-checking. At first, I assumed that the missing eggs were unrelated to our main characters and that Umbriel or some other Venin had stolen them or something, as I was unwilling to imagine that Xaden had become so evil that he was responsible. But on rereading a few things, I now think that this was part of Xaden's plan too. Granted, that would make him a decent amount more evil than I thought we'd see, but I also think there's one more big twist that could prove that it might not be quite as evil as it might seem on first impression. If I turn out to be right about this, it would be as big a spoiler as it gets, and I feel like it's beyond the scope of this video. I don't want anyone who came here just for a simple explanation of what already occurred in Onyx Storm to stumble into this huge potential spoiler for the next book. But if you do want to go down that rabbit hole, I'll put all of that into this other video, the biggest twist in Onyx Storm, and we all missed it. So make sure to subscribe and click the bell to be notified when that comes out. Also, if you're looking for some more Empyrean content to help cure your Onyx Storm book hangover, I'd suggest checking out my fanfiction, which retells the events of Fourth Wing from Xaden's point of view, including revelations from the following 2 books like Xaden and Garrick's Second Signets. Thanks for watching.